to defend the kingdom against Saddam Hussein and not rely on the Americans. And so it took Cheney a great deal of persuading to get Fahd to agree to allow the American troops in.
I made to the king at the direction of the president, and meeting with him in Jeddah on August 6th included specifically that we were prepared to deploy significant force to the kingdom, sufficient force to deter further aggression. Secondly, that we would stay as long as we are needed. And third, that we will leave when we are no longer needed or when we are asked to leave. And those, I think, were important considerations in the king's mind.
And it was this last condition, that American troops leave as soon as the fighting in Kuwait was over, that convinced King Fahd to accept the American offer and to reject the offer from Osama bin Laden. But when President Bush announced the victory in Kuwait at the end of February 1991, the decision had been made already not to invade Iraq, but to contain it from outside.
None of us want to move forces into Baghdad or frankly, we don't want to have any more fighting.
But the Americans would have to remain in Saudi Arabia to enforce the containment strategy. And so Fahd was faced with the permanent presence of American troops. And it was this repudiation of the U.S. promise that turned Osama bin Laden from an ally of the United States into a sworn enemy of this country.
The bodies of 5 Americans killed in a bomb attack in Saudi Arabia.
Car bombs exploded today outside a United States training facility in Riyadh.
A truck bomb exploded at the gates to a U.S. Air Force facility in Saudi Arabia this evening. There are deaths and there are scores of casualties.
Early this morning, 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa were the target of bombs. One ripped through the embassy in Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, at about 3:40 a.m. Eastern Time. Almost simultaneously, 450 miles to the north, a blast tore through the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi.
The USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. Al-Qaeda militants rammed an explosives-laden boat into the ship, killing 17 sailors.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Obviously, 9/11 had many causes and many roots. But I think if you try to understand what exactly led us to that terrible tragedy, you can't avoid the conclusion that oil had a big role to play.
As Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, and as a person working to secure this country, I take the words of the enemy very seriously, and so should the American people.
President Bush and his advisors like Karl Rove tell us repeatedly that we should take seriously the words of Osama bin Laden.
I recommend the book to you. If you've got $17, I recommend you go to the bookstore, go to Barnes & Noble or Borders, and pick up a book called Messages to the World. It's the collected writings of Osama bin Laden. He's a pretty smart guy and sophisticated. He wants to dominate the world. And the way to do it is one simple 3-letter word: oil.
If you read Osama bin Laden's words, his fatwas, you cannot escape seeing oil as lying at the root of Osama bin Laden's war against the United States. And so in our alliance with the royal family, which is rooted in our addiction to Saudi Arabian oil, we have in fact provided the fuel for Middle Eastern terrorism.
Repeat after me. I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
And this is my greatest complaint with the Bush administration. President Bush and Vice President Cheney had a remarkable opportunity in 2001. They could have chosen that moment. It was the perfect moment to say, we are at a turning point. We're in a new century. This is the time to plan ahead for the end of oil abundance.
The future is achievable if we make the right choices now. But if we fail to act, this great country could face a darker future. A future that is unfortunately being previewed in rising prices at the gas pump and rolling blackouts in the great state of California.
Because 9/11 was such a earth-shattering event, we tend to forget what Bush focused on in those early months of his administration.
What people need to hear, loud and clear, is that we're running out of energy in America. One thing is for certain, there are no short-term fixes. Reality is the nation has got a real problem when it comes to energy.
He came into office at a time when there was another energy crisis.
California is at ground zero of the energy crunch, suffering through rolling blackouts and soaring electricity rates.
Whoa, I thought this was only supposed to happen in California.
Big League Baseball was stopped.
And we had kind of a rolling blackout here.
Power company pulled the plug again on some businesses there and in Iowa and Illinois.
There were blackouts and long gas lines in many parts of the United States and high prices.
America faces a major energy supply crisis over the next 2 decades. The failure to meet this challenge will threaten our nation's economic prosperity, it will compromise our national security, and literally alter the way we live our lives.
And so, immediately, in one of his first acts, President Bush created the National Energy Policy Development Group, the NEPDG.
President Bush made a big new push today for his energy agenda with Vice President Cheney as his point man.
They began work almost immediately after taking office, issuing their final report, the National Energy Policy, on May 17, 2001.
I am really pleased with the work the Vice President and his folks did. This is a very optimistic look at America.
This is the major energy blueprint that continues to govern American energy policy today. So you would think that the administration would want to let the American public know who met with them when they framed it and what went on in those meetings.
Vice President Dick Cheney and congressional investigators may be on track for a head-on collision in court. Tomorrow is the deadline for deciding whether to take legal action to try to force Cheney to grant access to records of Cheney's Energy Task Force.
Dick Cheney has refused to make public the minutes of those meetings. All we know is who he met with, the top executives of America's leading energy companies, led by Chevron, ExxonMobil, and what was then the Enron Corporation before it went bankrupt. We also know that he refused to meet with any environmentalists.
We're going to make decisions based upon sound science, not some environmental fad.
Now, among the recommendations of the report, as is well known, is that the United States should allow drilling in Alaska at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR. And this has produced a great deal of controversy in this country.
Our plan confronts our increasing dependency on foreign sources of energy by calling for, and yes, it's true, I admit it, calling for increased domestic production of energy.
If you listen to the administration's rhetoric, you get the impression that there's enough oil in Alaska to supply all of America's needs.
ANWR could yield more than 1 million barrels a day, nearly as much as we import from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela.
If President Clinton had signed drilling in ANWR back in the 90s, we would be enjoying 1 million barrels a day more today.
If it costs a lot to fill up the tanks and they don't like that, well, demand that the supply increase, demand that oil be drilled offshore in ANWR and so on. And they aren't. Otherwise, shut up.
But the report makes clear that there's not nearly enough oil in the United States to satisfy our ever-growing needs. And therefore, it's very clear from reading through it that we have to rely increasingly on the Middle East and other foreign areas to satisfy rising U.S. requirements. And so what this debate did was to distract attention from other aspects of